Rona Walensky. I'm Director of Mindfulness Programs at PassageWorks Institute, and I'm one of your hosts for the Mindful Education Summit, which is brought to you by the Awake Network and Mindful. The topic of our session today is the science behind mindfulness, and our guest couldn't be a more eminent scientist in this field. We're with Richie Davidson, who is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he's founder of the Center for Healthy Minds. Richie is also one of the founders of the field of contemplative neuroscience, which we're going to discuss today, and he's the Chief Science Officer for the Mind and Life Institute. Welcome, Richie. I'm so glad you can be with us.
Thank you, Rona, and thank you for all the work you've done to help move this field along.
So it would be lovely if you would start us out with just an overview of this field of contemplative neuroscience. It's something that many people might not have heard of. Can you tell us about it and what it has found out about mindfulness?
Contemplative neuroscience is really the melding of two great knowledge traditions, wisdom traditions, one from the contemplative traditions, largely from the East, but also contemplative traditions in Western spiritual practices, and neuroscience, which is the study of the brain and the nervous system. One of the important developments in modern science that has enabled contemplative neuroscience to emerge and flourish are some key insights, one of which is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is simply the idea that the brain can change in response to experience or in response to training. And it's difficult to overestimate the importance of this idea because it provides the framework, the kind of mechanistic, in a scientific sense, mechanistic understanding for how changes in the brain occur that may underlie enduring well-being. We know a lot more about the mechanisms of plasticity today than we knew 20 years ago, and these insights have provided us with a framework for understanding how it is that a simple mental practice, like a mindfulness practice, can actually lead to systematic changes in the brain. And this insight has enabled scientific research in contemplative neuroscience to proceed, and it's this research, I think, which has been key to enabling this work to penetrate into different sectors of our culture that might not have initially been receptive to it, such as education. The second insight in modern science that is kind of the equivalent or parallel to neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics is epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how genes are regulated. And this insight can be summarized in this way. We are all born with DNA, which is a fixed complement of base pairs. And for the most part, for most people, the sequence of base pairs is not going to change. But what will change is the extent to which different genes are turned on or turned off. Genes have molecular volume controls that can be regulated. And it turns out that the environments in which we live influence these molecular mechanisms of regulation. They can turn on or turn off genes. We also know that our emotional demeanor is very important in influencing our epigenetics. And the way a mother behaves toward her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in the offspring. And so all of this work together points us to understanding that the expression of our genes is dynamic, and is dynamic in a way which is similar to our brain. Just as our brains change with experience, so too does the expression of our genes change in response to experience. Another element in modern science that's been so important in enabling this work to go forward is our increased understanding of how the circuits in the brain that are influenced by practices like mindfulness are connected to the body. So brains are embodied. They don't exist in a vat, in a vacuum. And it turns out that our bodies influence our brains and our brains influence our bodies. The communication is unequivocally bidirectional. And this insight is so important because, for one thing, it allows us to better understand how it is that our mental states, and particularly our sense of well-being, may actually not simply be a subjective feeling, but may actually be something which influences our bodies. And so there is a plethora of evidence now that suggests that well-being is associated with physical health. People who report higher levels of well-being are healthier. Now, this is not true of everyone. There are many exceptions to this, but if you test thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in epidemiological studies, you will see that this relationship is present. And so it invites the possibility that if we engage in practices which cultivate well-being, these practices will change specific brain circuits. And when these brain circuits are changed, they will influence bodily systems in ways that will promote increased physical health. So that's an exciting proposition, and one that is empirically tractable.
So one short way of saying this is you can teach old dogs new tricks, is one piece of advice that comes out of this. But I think it might be helpful to our viewers to understand a little more of what you mean by well-being. It sounds like it's mental and emotional well-being that can impact our physical health, or maybe there's a broader definition you have in mind.
Yes, so I'd be happy to talk about well-being, but before I talk about that, let me just mention very briefly a fourth theme in modern science which has enabled this work to proceed. I've talked about three so far. I've talked about neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and the bidirectional communication between the mind and brain and the body. So there's a fourth theme which is also really important, one that I'm particularly excited about. And the way I name this fourth theme is that every human being comes into the world with innate basic goodness. And there is now a growing body of scientific evidence to support this. And this is a theme and an assertion which surprises many people and to many people seems inconsistent with the reality in which we live today. And it's one of the reasons why I feel it's so important to speak about this. The data show that if you look at very young infants, and here I'm referring to infants in the first 6 months of life, and you present them with age-appropriate stimuli and the kinds of scenarios that have been used with babies of this age are puppets often. So you can have puppets that are engaged in interactions, and if you have puppets engaged in a warm-hearted interaction, and you compare that to puppets who are engaged in a selfish interaction, and you then present the puppets to the babies and see which it reaches for, which do the viewers think babies will reach for? Well, the data are very, very clear. Babies reach for the puppets that were engaged in warm-hearted interactions. And this kind of research has been done very, very carefully. It is not the physical characteristics of the puppet. That's all been randomized and controlled. It has to do with the way the puppets are behaving. And if they're behaving in a warm-hearted way, they are preferentially chosen. And there's a whole genre of experiments that have been done like this, and they all show the same thing. And so that's a super important finding, because it suggests that when we engage in practices to cultivate loving kindness and compassion, we're actually not creating anything from scratch, so to speak. We're not creating these qualities de novo, but what we are actually doing is nurturing seeds that are already present. We are, in some sense, becoming more familiar with the fundamental nature of our own mind, which has at its core this innate basic goodness. And so that's very exciting. So you asked about well-being. Let me move on to well-being and say that in our work, we look at 4 specific constituents of well-being. And, you know, it's whenever a psychologist or neuroscientist begins to grapple with a complex mental construct like well-being, or it could be, you know, in the cognitive sphere like memory or attention, what we'd like to do is we like to identify what are the more elementary constituents from which this more global construct is comprised. And with well-being, there are 4 constituents that we think are critical. The first we call awareness. Awareness is so critical, and it's normally not thought of as a constituent of well-being, but to quote the subtitle of a major scientific paper that came out on this topic a few years ago, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So being attentionally distracted is toxic to our well-being. And, you know, I think that this probably is not that surprising to viewers when we are able to really show up and be present and fully focused on what we're doing. People tend to report higher levels of well-being than when their mind is wandering and when they're distracted. So awareness is the first constituent. Second constituent we call connection. Connection refers to the constellation of emotions which are critical for successful and harmonious social relationships. Emotions like gratitude and appreciation and kindness and compassion, all of that we would subsume under connection, as part of connection. It's the glue that facilitates interpersonal relationships. And so here is where the innate basic goodness is so important, and practices that are designed to cultivate these qualities are actually very accessible. And the scientific literature shows that people can learn those practices very quickly, and they have effects very quickly. So that's the second constituent of well-being. The third constituent of well-being we call insight. And what we mean here is insight into how the narrative that we carry around in our minds about who we are, the self-narrative, how it actually operates. And so often we find it helpful in describing this constituent of well-being to talk about an extreme end of the continuum, which is the lack of well-being. And here you might reflect on the situation of a depressed individual. Someone who is suffering from depression has a narrative that they carry around which is negative. It is a narrative about their lack of self-worth or lack of self-efficacy, and they actually believe the narrative. They believe that this narrative, these thoughts in their head, are a veridical depiction of who they are. And so insight is really about understanding what this narrative is, first and foremost. And what it is a bag of thoughts. That's what the narrative is. And it's fundamentally no different than any other thought. And so when you can begin to see that as thoughts that are sort of like clouds in the sky, they appear, they may move, and then they disappear. And when we become excessively identified with these thoughts, we reify this sense of self, and we know that that is a great cause of suffering. So the third constituent of well-being then is insight. The fourth constituent of well-being is purpose. We know that being able to identify a core purpose in life is something absolutely fundamental to our well-being. We know that having a sense of purpose in this way has really dramatic biological consequences. There are very compelling data to show that people in the last decade or two of their life, if you look, for example, in people in their 70s and 80s, if you look at psychological characteristics, it turns out that purpose in life is the single best predictor of longevity compared to any other psychological variable, and after you account for medical history and medical conditions. So it is a powerful predictor of physical health. So one of the things that we also know about each of these four constituents of well-being, awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, is each of them is represented in different circuits in the brain. These circuits exhibit plasticity. They can be influenced by experience and context. They can also be changed or transformed through training. And so these are the four constituents that we focus on. We believe that these are the four most important, and we also believe that each of these can be changed.
That's a powerful view of science and human nature. Can you share a little bit about what you and people at your center know about the way in which mindfulness practices, especially in education, because that's a theme of our summit here, how that takes advantage of the themes of neuroscience and these themes of well-being to actually improve the quality of life and the quality of education for educators?
Certainly. The mindfulness piece would be mostly subsumed under the awareness constituent, the awareness element that we talked about in terms of well-being. And there's a reason why we put it first. And we put it first because we think it is the foundational building block. We think that it will enable and facilitate all the other forms of well-being. And that if you don't have that first piece, it's like building a house on a very unstable structure, unstable foundation. We need to have this basic mindfulness piece. William James, in his great two-volume tome, The Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890, he has a whole chapter on attention. And he said in that chapter on attention that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again, he said, is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And he went on to say that an education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. And so really what he was talking about is mindfulness education. And this is the fundamental building block of all other forms of learning. If we're not fully present with what is in front of us, it will significantly constrain our ability to retain that information. So it's super important. We also know that there are certain kinds of qualities like resilience. And the way we define resilience in a very sort of hard-nosed scientific way Resilience is the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The rapidity with which you recover from adversity. And so what that means is that some people, when bad stuff happens, they can recover quickly, and other people have a prolonged response that can perseverate. And it turns out this is so important. And we know from hard-nosed research that mindfulness practices can improve resilience. I should quickly add, however, not to mislead viewers, that the evidence for this indicates that you only begin to see this after quite a bit of practice. It's not something that arises immediately. Summarizing across a number of major research studies, I would put it at somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 hours of practice before you really begin to see an impact on objective measures of resilience from mindfulness practices. Now, in the scheme of things, 1,500 to 2,000 hours, we would consider that in the kind of meditation research that we've done to be very much a beginner. But still, it's quite a number of hours, but it's doable for most people. But it also reminds us that we need to be patient with this. It's like changing the course of a river that's been flowing in the same direction for many years. These changes are gradual.
Do you have any advice for educators who sometimes find it hard to imagine 10 minutes a day of practice? The lives of educators are often overwhelmed by the demands of schools and demands of families and their own children, their own parents, economic worries. It's one of the most stressful professions we have in our country.
Yeah, I do have advice. First, let me start by saying that I deeply appreciate and respect and honor the kind of challenges that they face, having done research in this area and spending time with teachers in public school settings. I know that what you're saying is true in a very challenging way. And so I think what you're naming is a real issue. What our suggestion to people is this. We ask people to please honestly reflect on their life and taking into account all the challenges and responsibilities that they have. And for each person to come up for herself or himself with a number that represents the number of minutes you think you can practice every day for 30 days continuously without a break. That is doing it for 30 consecutive days, even if that number is 1 minute, that's okay. Perfectly okay. But we'd like you to choose an amount of time where you will make an unswerving commitment to practice that amount every day for 30 days without a break. We want you to be realistic, and we want you to be successful. So pick the number. And what we find is when we do that, people can choose a number that they could stick to. And then you just slowly build up from there. And, even if the number is 1 or 2 minutes, what people often find is if they only could do it for 2 minutes at the time they chose, then they may spontaneously have another 2 minutes when they're commuting or when they're waiting in line for something. And they spontaneously could do it then. And they realize that, you could do it anywhere, anytime. It becomes much more accessible. It's not instantaneous, but it is a way to help ensure that success will be the outcome rather than failure. There are programs out there where the expectation is that a person will practice for 45 minutes a day, and the vast majority of people don't do that. And so you set a person up for failure rather than success. And I think there are ways to do this that maximize the likelihood of being successful.
One of the other benefits is if people practice consistently for 30 days, they're likely to discover that even that small amount of 1 or 2 minutes might actually change something in the quality of their lives.
Exactly.
So Richie, we've come to the end of our time. I know that you're a very busy man, so thank you so much for this overview and for the very concrete suggestion to help our educators get started in a practice.
You're most welcome, Rhoda. Thank you for everything.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.